Blood on the white marble. That was the first thing anyone noticed when the doors opened. A single dark smear across the luminescent floor of the conclave's grand antechamber, thin and precise, like someone had dragged a finger through it and kept walking. The automated sanitation systems hadn't caught it yet. Or perhaps they had, and simply didn't recognize the substance. Human blood, after all, looked nothing like what bled from the other 47 species gathered on Verath Station this week. The second thing anyone noticed was the translator standing in the corner. No, that's wrong. Nobody noticed the translator standing in the corner. That was, as it would turn out, the most important thing that happened all morning. Here is a question nobody thought to ask. Why would a man with 11 languages, fluent, not functional, not conversational, not I can order food and apologize fluent, but the kind of fluent that means he had published 3 peer-reviewed papers on Keth nonverbal communication structures, why would a man like that accept a contract that paid a specialist grade 4 rate, wore the gray uniform of background furniture, and required him to stand by a pillar for 6 hours at a stretch without being spoken to? The conclave's hiring coordinator hadn't asked. She'd seen the language scores. She'd seen the cultural immersion certifications. She'd processed his documentation with the efficiency of someone who had processed 11,000 contractor applications and was on her 14th hour of the same day. And she had said, cheerfully, "This is a peace summit, Mr. Okafor, not a battlefield." He had smiled and said, "Of course." She had not asked why a man who spoke 11 languages had taken the time, across 12 years of what his application described as field operations experience, to learn that many. Most professional translators developed their portfolios through academic channels, universities, cultural immersion programs, conclave-sponsored linguistic institutes. They learned languages in sequence, deliberately, each one building on the last. They had specializations, regions, taxonomic focuses. James Okafor's 11 languages were not academic. They were not sequential. They were not specialized by region or taxon. They were, if anyone had looked carefully and nobody had, precisely the 11 languages that a person would need to operate without a communication barrier in the 14 most politically volatile contact zones in known space over the past 12 years. His file was thorough. The language section, the certifications, the published papers. Page 4 was less thorough. Page 4 was 3 paragraphs behind solid black bars and a government agency's redaction stamp, followed by a 4th paragraph that read, in its entirety, secondary qualification, field operations experience. The hiring coordinator had not reached page 4. This is the thing about invisible men. The invisibility is not always accidental. The Verath Accords Summit had been 3 years in the making, and the Grand Assembly Hall was doing its best to justify the expense. Verath Station occupied a gravitational equilibrium point between 3 star systems, neutral ground by geometry, which was the only kind of neutral ground that actually held. The assembly hall itself was a sphere of polished white stone and bioluminescent paneling that pulsed in slow, cooperative rhythms calibrated to be simultaneously soothing to 7 different sensory modalities. The air was a negotiated mixture compromised on oxygen content, compromised on nitrogen ratio, compromised on humidity in the way that everything at a summit is compromised, which is to say that nobody was quite comfortable and everyone was equally uncomfortable, which passed for fairness. 48 species. The Keth Sovereignty senior delegation arrived in rigid formation, the great cephalopod bodies of the senior delegates rippling with the subvocal threat displays they probably didn't know they were making. The Varenni Arbitration Assembly occupied the central dais with the specific quality of ease that belongs to species who designed the room. Tall, silver-skinned, elongated in the way of beings who evolved in 0.3 standard gravity, long bones, fluid motion, the particular grace of creatures for whom the world has never pushed back very hard. The Pellucid Shoals representatives moved within sealed mobile water columns that hummed and pressurized and made the air nearby smell of minerals and deep ocean. 3 members of the Hur collective stood in their corner, compound eyes unmoving, chitinous armor plates the rust red of old iron, so still that a visitor unfamiliar with Hur biology might have wondered if they were statues. James watched the Hur. He was watching the Hur specifically, not the way a linguist watches a species, cataloging, studying, but in the way a man watches something that has filed itself in the back of his mind, in a folder he hasn't consciously opened yet. The Hor Collective had sent observers, officially. Non-voting delegates. The Hor were not party to the Varenni border dispute. But the Hor Collective's outer zone commercial interests would contract dramatically if that border dispute resolved peacefully. James had not been given this information in any briefing. He had assembled it himself from 3 separate sources in the background reading he'd done on the transport from Theta Station, because reading background documents and then asking questions of the spaces between the facts was, like the languages, like the watching, something he had been doing for a very long time. He set the thought down, not discarding it. Filing it in the same quiet place he filed everything that might matter later. He stood by his pillar. His tablet displayed the cascade of real-time linguistic data. He looked, to anyone who glanced at him, like a man doing exactly the job he'd been hired to do. He counted the catering staff. 11. He noted the count, noted the individuals, noted the subtle chromatic discoloration on the left wrist of the Varenni woman managing the Eastern Refreshment Station, an old chemical burn, probably, and filed all of it without any particular alarm. It was simply information. It would either become relevant or it wouldn't. The session was scheduled to begin in 8 minutes. James picked up his tablet, set it down again, and did the thing that he had been doing at regular intervals for the past 3 hours. He looked at the room the way a sculptor looks at a piece of marble. Not at what it was, but at all the things it could become. He looked at the exits, at the angles, at the elevated media gallery above the north wall. He looked at the catering staff. He counted them again. 13. He held very still. There it is, he thought, with the specific quality of calm that is not the absence of alarm but the practiced management of it. There it is. 2 of the catering staff had changed. Not the uniforms, the pale gold was identical. But the individuals were different. The Varenni woman with the chemical burn scar on her wrist was gone. In her place, at the Eastern Station, stood someone taller, with the precise controlled stillness of a being working very hard at looking casual. And the specific quality of that stillness, the absolute absence of the small, constant micro-adjustments of boredom, of professional routine, of a mind engaged with inventory and service timing, was a quality that James Okafor recognized the way a musician recognizes a wrong note. Not consciously, not analytically, in the stomach. He looked at the second replacement. Near the main entrance. Right hand on the cart handle with a grip approximately 30% firmer than the task required. He looked at the media gallery. He looked at the position of the Keth delegation relative to the central dais. He looked at the doors. He put his tablet on the pillar ledge, face down, and put his hands in his pockets and walked unhurried, gray-uniformed, invisible toward the Eastern Refreshment Station. Nobody watched him go. This, too, would turn out to matter. Here is another question. What do you say to a professional assassin who is standing behind a catering cart in a room full of 48 alien diplomatic delegations when you have no weapon, no backup, and exactly the amount of time it takes to cross 6 meters of marble floor before they recognize that you've recognized them? James had an answer. He stopped 2 meters from the cart. He looked at the figure behind it. He said, in perfect Varenni formal register, not station standard, not the simplified diplomatic variant, but the deep formal register with the honorific gradations that took most non-Varenni linguists a decade to master, the third-tier refreshments appear to have run short. The Keth delegation has made specific requests regarding the enzyme supplements in the reception blend. It was entirely fabricated. There were no enzyme supplements. He had invented the phrase in the 4 seconds of his approach, calibrated to a specific purpose. It was the kind of sentence that required an immediate, specific, knowledgeable response from a real catering worker. A sentence designed not to gather information but to generate it. The figure stared at him for 1.3 seconds. A real catering worker, half a second, already reaching for a tablet. 1.3 seconds of absolute stillness. I will check the reserves. Grammatically correct. Accent clean on the surface. But the word order was Varenni secondary dialect, not station formal, not the register a station-employed catering worker would use. And at close range, James could see what he'd suspected from across the room. The subdermal patterning that Varenni's skin carries in its deeper layers, the bioluminescent microstructures that pulse and shift with autonomic function, was absent. The skin tone was close. The surface was right. But underneath, nothing moved. Not Varenni. And the Varenni eyes make constant micro-adjustments to ambient light, a function of their deep-water evolutionary heritage. A movement so small it's invisible unless you know to look for it. These eyes were absolutely fixed, practiced. The eyes of a professional maintaining a cover, which requires holding the eyes steady in a way that no unstressed being naturally does. James had been studying alien eyes, among other things, for 12 years. "Of course," he said pleasantly. He took 2 steps past the cart. Then he pivoted, and the question of what a man says when he's buying 6 seconds was answered by what a man does with them. The palm strike hit the false caterer in the sternum. Here is the physics of it, which several Varenni medical researchers would later attempt to model for the incident report and would keep getting wrong because they kept using the wrong gravity constant. James Okafor was born on a world with 1.0 standard gravity. He had been processing 1.0 g through his skeleton, his musculature, his cardiovascular system every moment of his life. When he moved, walked, ran, struck, his body generated force calibrated for Earth. Verath Station's environmental systems maintained 0.6 standard gravity for the comfort of the majority of species present. What this meant, in practice, was that when James Okafor threw his body weight into a strike in 0.6 g, he was essentially a spring that had been compressed for a 1.0 g environment and released into a 0.6 g one. The false caterer left the ground. Not far 8 inches, perhaps, but 8 inches of air beneath the feet of a being whose skeleton was designed for 0.4 g, launched by an impact that delivered approximately 1.8 times what their body's structural load tolerances were built for, is a specific and decisive kind of problem. The second replacement, near the main entrance, moved the instant the first one hit the floor. Moved fast, the liquid speed of a driven professional, which was the species James had been suspecting since the false quality of the first figure's stillness, because driven mercenaries were the species most consistently hired for operations in this sector, and their speed in 0.6 g was genuinely extraordinary. What James had in response to speed? Not speed. He was not the fastest thing in the room. He had geometry. He was already moving, not toward the second figure, not yet, because there was a third, emerging from behind the northern refreshment partition with something in its hands that was not a serving tray, and the third was the immediate threat because the object it held was pointed at the central dais and the Keth delegation was right there, Vorchuk rising to his full 8 feet with his mantle spreading in the threat display that said, "I am the dominant thing in this room," which was magnificent and tactically catastrophic. James crossed the distance to the third figure in 4 strides. In 0.6 g, his stride was wrong-looking to the witnesses. Too long. Too forceful. Each footfall landing with a solidity that the decorative marble registered and would remember as stress fractures in the forensic analysis. His body was doing what it always did, which was to move in the way Earth had built it to move, and Earth specifications were substantially over-engineered for the current environment. He hit the weapon arm upward. The device discharged into the ceiling, a pale violet line of coherent energy that burned a meter-long scar in the decorative paneling. He torqued the arm backward through its rotational axis until the joint, not built for this, not built for anything like this, expressed an opinion. The figure made a sound. Chitinous clicking. James filed it. Horror-adjacent vocalization. Operative, not mercenary. Someone's intelligence asset. He stepped on the weapon, broke it under his heel, and turned. The Varenni honor guard was moving. 2 of them not toward the threats, toward James. Because a gray-uniformed translator in the act of breaking someone's arm was the anomaly, and they were trained to respond to anomalies. South entrance. He used Varenni formal command register, not the polite request form, not the bureaucratic notice form, but the register that in Varenni hierarchical grammar is used exclusively by beings of confirmed superior authority. He had no superior authority. He was a specialist grade 4 contractor. He used the register anyway because the register was a tool and he was very good at using tools. 2 more. South entrance. Moving on the dais. One guard hesitated, looked south, saw the second Dreven, no longer bothering with the cart. Something drawn from beneath the gold uniform and held at its side. The guard pivoted south. The other kept coming toward James. James sidestepped, clean, let the guard's momentum carry past, caught the pauldron of the honor armor and used the guard's own movement to redirect. Secure the floor contact. Same command register. The tone of a superior officer who has delegated a task and expects it completed. The guard complied. Probably shouldn't have, by protocol. Probably spent some time thinking about that later. The result was, the floor contact was secured. James was already across the hall. The south entrance Dreven was fast. Fast in the way that species designed for 0.4 G are fast in 0.6 G, taking full advantage of reduced gravitational resistance, moving with a loping fluid efficiency that looked almost beautiful. It was covering the distance to the central dais at a rate that would get it there in approximately 3 seconds. James was running. And here is the question that Conclave security analysts would spend considerable time on afterward. A Dreven professional in 0.6 G should have been faster. By any biomechanical model, James Okafor should not have been able to close the distance. The calculations kept coming out wrong. The calculations kept using 0.6 G for James too. But James's legs had been generating propulsive force for 1.0 G since the first time he stood up as a child. His muscles fired at an intensity calibrated for a world that pushed back harder than this one. In 0.6 G, the result was each stride covering ground that the stride was not architecturally designed to cover, not through any conscious adjustment, not through technique, but through the simple physics of a spring released into a gentler medium than the one that compressed it. He hit the Dreven from behind and left at a combined closing speed that made the subsequent impact what the medical report would describe as mechanically disproportionate to visual assessment of the human subject's size. Left arm around the throat. Right hand controlling the weapon arm. 187 pounds of Earth gravity human applied through the full vector of a combat-trained takedown in an environment that offered 40% less resistance than his body had ever practiced in. They hit the marble floor together. James felt the impact through his whole skeleton and processed it the way he processed all field impacts, as information, not interruption. The Dreven under him did not process it the same way. The Dreven's processing of it was, structurally speaking, over fairly quickly. The weapon clattered free. James came up with it. Assessed in the same motion, unfamiliar manufacturer. Charging coil left side. Safety here pointed it at the Dreven. Silence fell across the grand assembly hall like a dropped curtain. Not complete silence. The alarms. The Pellucid Shoals emergency venting. Vorchuk's threat display still pushing subsonic vibration James could feel in his back teeth. A Varenni noble somewhere to his left making a sound his brain filed as acute distress. But the particular silence of a room full of beings who have just watched something they do not have a conceptual category for, that silence was absolute and entire and profound. James swept the room. South clear. East, guard had the third figure. First figure, still down. One more. There should be. Human. The voice came from above, and it came from the elevated media gallery that James had noted an underweight. And this was a real mistake, the kind he would note internally with the specific language he reserved for genuine operational failures, which was not dramatic and was not self-flagellating and was simply mistake. Adjust. He moved without completing the thought, spinning left, dropping into a crouch, the way his body moved when the back of his brain sent the signal before the front had finished processing Y, and the shot from the gallery burned through the space where his torso had been and caught the outer edge of his right shoulder instead. The jacket self-extinguished in under a second. His shoulder sent a detailed report that he allocated the precise amount of attention the tactical situation required, which was, noted, insufficient reason to stop. He came up, acquired the gallery, fired twice. Both shots missed. This too would be analyzed later. The consensus would be that he had fired knowing he would miss, that the purpose of the shots was not to hit but to move, to displace the gallery figure from its position, to force it into sightlines that the Varenni honor guard could use. That this was a calculated sacrifice of accuracy in exchange for positional exposure. The analysts would debate whether this demonstrated exceptional tactical thinking or was simply what he later told them it was. I didn't know the gun. I fired to make him move because moving was the only thing that would put him in the guard's line of fire. The gallery figure moved. The plasma lance did what it was designed to do. The fourth attacker stopped being a problem. James held his crouch for a count of 3. Swept the room in quadrants, the way he'd been taught to sweep rooms in places the conclave didn't have briefing documents about. Left, right, high, low, for threats. All resolved. He stood. His right shoulder was making the case for immediate medical attention. He noted the case, assessed its urgency as non-critical at this time, and stood up straight. He adjusted his gray translator's jacket. The right shoulder seam was gone, the fabric there reduced to char-edged ruin that exposed the undershirt beneath and, below that, the skin, and on the skin, the scars. The room saw them. Old scars. The kind that form when wounds heal over months rather than hours. Silver and topographic, running from the right shoulder down across the deltoid in patterns that told a story to anyone who knew how to read the language of damage and recovery. Not the clean lines of surgical intervention. The landscapes of things that had happened far from medical facilities, healed by a body that simply refused to do otherwise. The Varenni High Arbiter Selene was staring at them. Vorchuk was staring at them. The Hor observers, who had not moved through any of this, who had remained in their corner with a stillness that was now, in retrospect, a different kind of stillness than it had appeared, were staring at them. James said, in precise formal Varenni, "The assembly hall is secure. For attackers, all neutralized. The High Arbiter and Delegate Vorchuk are unharmed." He paused. "I would also note," he added, shifting registers completely, into Keth primary dialect with the tonal inflection that indicates respectful observation between equals, that there appears to be a scheduling conflict with the refreshment service. Someone will need to address this before the session begins. Vorchuk's chromatophores cycled through 3 full color sequences in rapid succession. James translated them privately and automatically. "I am attempting to determine whether what I am experiencing is terror, gratitude, or something my language does not have a word for." He kept his expression neutral, because if he let anyone see that he was reading those colors, if any of them understood that he had been reading those colors for 2 years, that he had been reading this room since he walked into it, that the gray uniform and the pillar and the tablet were a kind of camouflage as deliberate as anything he'd worn in the field, then the question of who James Okafor actually was would become urgent and public, and he preferred that question to remain, for now, in the category of things nobody had thought to ask. They put him in a side chamber. The furniture was designed for beings with a different center of gravity. The temperature was 4 degrees warmer than he preferred. There was water, actual water, and something that approximated food. He ate it because his body was filing increasingly pointed resource requests and because eating gave him something to do with his hands while the parade of officials processed through the door. Conclave security coordinators. Varenni intelligence liaisons. A legal protocol officer who needed to be reminded twice that the weapon had been taken from an attacker and set down within 8 seconds. He answered all of them accurately, in their preferred languages and registers, because he was very good at his job. All of his job. None of them, not one, across 40 minutes of debriefing, asked the question that mattered. None of them asked, "How did you know?" They asked what he'd seen. They asked what he'd done. They asked for timeline, for sequence, for the physical mechanics of each engagement. But not one of them asked how a linguistic specialist had looked at a room of catering staff and seen what a full Varenni security detail had not. Deputy Director Calith arrived last and asked it. She sat across from him with the expression of someone running a calculation that kept producing an answer she didn't expect. 40 years in conclave security. Senior chromatic marking under her left ear, the deep indigo that Varenni service culture awards only at the 3-decade threshold. She set his file on the table between them. "Page 4. she said. Yes. 3 tours. 75th Ranger Regiment. She looked at him. United States Army. Earth. Yes. A pause. Your application listed your secondary qualification as Field Operations Experience. That's accurate. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Okafor, I have read the unredacted version of your file. I have clearance for the unredacted version of your file. The unredacted version of your file dash, a pause, explains several things I was having difficulty explaining. James said nothing. He waited. He was very good at waiting. It does not explain, she continued, why you are here, why you specifically are here as a specialist grade 4 contractor at this particular summit in this particular role. James picked up the water and took a drink. Set it down. The Varenni border situation, he said. 6 years of escalating tension. The outer zone contested claims. If the summit fails, you're looking at the first major interstellar conflict in 40 years. Conservative mortality projections dash, he paused. A lot of people would die. Yes, said Caliph. I know that. What I'm asking is, why are you here? The question sat in the air between them. James looked at the table. He looked at the water glass. He looked at the wall behind Caliph's head, which was smooth and white and told him nothing, and then he looked back at her. Because I speak Keth, he said. All of it. Caliph waited. Most translators cover the verbal register, James said. The mouth sounds in Keth terminology. The official language. The words. He set his hands flat on the table. I also cover the chromatic register. Caliph was very still. The color language, she said. The Keth believe the verbal register is what they choose to say. The chromatic register is what they can't help but mean. If you're negotiating with the Keth sovereignty and you're only reading the words dash, he paused. You're reading half of what's being communicated. You're building an agreement on top of half the available information. And you, Caliph said carefully, can read both halves. That's why I'm here, James said. That's the whole reason I'm here. Caliph looked at him for a long moment. That is not in your file. No, James said. It isn't. She let that sit for a moment. Then, the attackers. Dreven mercenaries, primarily. Paid by elements of the Hur collective who do not want this summit to succeed. The third operative, the one with Hur physiological characteristics, was carrying a disruption device calibrated to Keth bioelectric frequencies. It would have incapacitated the Keth delegation without physical harm. Created chaos. In the chaos dash, the Dreven finished the work, James said. Keth delegation incapacitated, Varenni security fails to protect them, or appears to have failed to protect them, and the Keth sovereignty loses a senior delegation in Varenni-hosted space. The Hur collective frames it as a Varenni security failure, possibly complicity. Keth goes to war footing. Summit collapses. Outer zone contested claims become the trigger within 18 months. Caliph watched him. You analyzed all of that in the 40 minutes you've been in this room. Yes. Not during dash. During what I was doing, James said. I was thinking about where the next threat was coming from. She looked at his shoulder. At the regenerative membrane the medical team had applied, which was doing its quiet and extraordinary work. The medical team noted an unusual pain response. You didn't display distress indicators consistent with a second-degree plasma burn. It hurt, he said. I had other things going on. The attending physician speculated that either their calibration was incorrect dash, or my species has a different threshold, James said. Both are true. Earth's gravity is 1.0 standard. Our evolutionary history includes 2 million years of being prey for things that were larger and faster than we were. Our biology developed dash, he thought about how to say this, workarounds. Pain suppression under acute stress. Adrenaline chemistry that overrides signals that would incapacitate lower gravity species. Bones that are dense enough to take impact loads that most galactic species' skeletal structures were never designed to encounter. You're describing yourself as physically exceptional. I'm describing myself as normal, James said. For a human, I'm describing what Earth made out of 2 million years of trying to kill us. Caliph looked at him for a long time. Mr. Okafor, she said finally, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. Did you know, when you accepted this contract, that there was a threat to this summit? The question was the right question. The question was precisely the right question, and Caliph had 40 years of experience and she had read the unredacted file, and she deserved the honest answer. James looked at her steadily. I suspected, he said, that a summit of this significance, involving this many competing interests, in a station whose security model was designed for ceremony rather than active threat response, in a political environment where at least one faction had strong material reasons to prevent success. He stopped. I thought it was worth being careful. That's all. That's all, Caliph repeated. I was there to translate, James said. Everything else was contingency. A contingency that saved the lives of the Keth senior delegation and the Varenni High Arbiter and prevented a war. Yes, in 14 seconds. Give or take. That seems like a long time, Caliph said. And there was something in it, not quite humor, not quite horror, not quite awe. That was all three of those things at once, which was James had found how most beings reacted to humans when they finally understood what they were looking at. James walked back through the main corridor 2 hours later and nearly walked into Vorchuk. The Keth senior delegate was enormous in the corridor's confined space, 8 feet of diplomat with his mantle fully settled. His chromatic displays in the muted complex patterns of formal engagement. He had 3 secondary attendants at a distance. He looked at James with his primary visual cluster, which in Keth body language is the mode of looking that indicates the subject has the entirety of the observer's attention. Most beings, upon being regarded with the entirety of Vorchuk's attention, took a small step backward. James said, in Keth formal register, delegate. The chromatic display shifted. You used my name language, it said, in the colors underneath the meeting. Not the trade tongue. My sounds. You speak Keth, Vorchuk said aloud. Not a question. Processing. 11 languages, James said. Keth primary was my third. I started with it because the chromatic component interested me. The idea that a language carries a visual register conveying an entirely separate informational layer from the verbal. It took me 2 years to read it reliably. Vorchuk's primary visual cluster focused on him with a new quality of attention. 2 years, he said. You studied our colors for 2 years. The verbal language without the chromatic register is like James searched for the right Keth idiom. Listening to music with the melody removed. You hear something. You don't hear the song. A silence. Vorchuk's mantle shifted through a sequence that James read as, I am encountering a category of thing I did not know existed. My people, the delegate said slowly, believe the colors are truth. The words are what we choose to say. The colors are what we cannot help but mean. I know, James said. It's the primary reason I learned them. Something happened in Vorchuk's chromatic display that James had no perfect translation for. It sat in a register adjacent to formal gratitude but carried undertones of something older, something that the Keth visual grammar used when encountering a being that had taken one of your most sacred privacies, the involuntary truth of your color language, and treated it not as intelligence to exploit but as something worth knowing. What do my colors say now? Vorchuk asked. James looked carefully. Read it fully. The sequence was complex, layered in the way that Keth emotional states are always layered, because the Keth do not experience singular feelings but chords of them, and Vorchuk's chord right now was rich and strange. Gratitude, he said. The specific form that acknowledges a debt that cannot be repaid, not as a transaction but as a permanent bond. There's no Varenni equivalent. He paused. And underneath that, a reassessment. The recognition that a category you believed you understood was wrong. You, Vorchuk said. Humans, perhaps. Or me specifically. Both. The great mantle settled. In the Keth sovereignty there is a concept. Vorkale. He was quiet for a moment. It means a weapon that also speaks. We teach it to our young as a philosophical ideal, a being in whom violence and wisdom exist in the same hands without contradiction, without one diminishing the other. A pause. We believed it a metaphor. James waited. I did not believe, Vorchuk said, that such a thing was real. His chromatophores shifted into a color James had studied extensively in Keth linguistic literature and never personally witnessed outside of academic reproductions. A deep sustained blue-violet sitting in the formal greeting register but carrying the full weight of the gratitude bond sequence simultaneously. A color that, in Keth social grammar, is used exclusively between beings of recognized equal standing, regardless of their formal hierarchical positions. A senior delegate of the Keth sovereignty was saluting a specialist grade 4 contractor. James straightened. He responded in Keth formal register, verbal and chromatic simultaneously, the chromatic component limited to what his hands could do, which he'd been practicing for 2 years from instructional texts because he'd understood that being able to read Keth was less than half the tool. A specific configuration of fingers and wrist that in Keth visual grammar carries the meaning received and honored between equals. Vorchuk's primary visual cluster fixed on his hands for 3 full seconds. When the delegate looked back up, his display had shifted into something James didn't have a precise translation for, and he was sufficiently honest with himself to know it. You did not lead with the fighting, Vorchuk said. No. Why? James thought about this honestly. Because the fighting isn't who I am. The something I know how to do when it's necessary. The language is who I am. I'd rather be in a room talking than in a room fighting. Every time. Without exception. And yet, Vorchuk said softly, when fighting became necessary, you were better at it than our security forces. Different preparation for different circumstances, James said. Your security forces were trained for a controlled environment. I was trained for environments where the threat is never controlled. I don't know how to do anything in a controlled environment. Something moved through Vorchuk's display that James's 2 years of study couldn't fully resolve. It sat near wonder. It sat near grief. Tell me about your world, the delegate said, and the color underneath the words said, I need to understand where you come from, because I need to understand what you are, because what you are has changed how I see everything. They stood in the corridor for 40 minutes. James talked. He started with the Serengeti because the Serengeti is the most efficient argument for everything that followed. He described the predator density species that outweighed early humans by an order of magnitude, that ran faster, that had natural armor, natural weapons, night vision, pack coordination. He described the disease environment, the microbial battlefield that ran in parallel with the macrofaunal one, selecting ruthlessly for immune systems that were, by galactic standards, extraordinarily aggressive. He described the climate instability across the evolutionary period temperature swings that required a species without fur, without significant fat reserves, without instinctive migration patterns to invent its way out of extinction, repeatedly under existential pressure. You had no natural armor, Vorchuk said. No natural weapons. Not in the biological sense. Fingernails. Blunt teeth. No significant speed advantage over the predators that hunted you. In short distance, none. We developed persistence hunting chasing prey at moderate speed until it died of heat exhaustion. We sweat. Most of Earth's predators don't, not the same way. In a hot environment over a long distance, a human who won't stop is more dangerous than almost anything else on the planet. Not fast. Just relentless. Vorchuk's display ran through a sequence that James read as, I am revising an assumption I did not know I was making. You built weapons, the delegate said. Eventually. And clothing. And fire. And agriculture. And cities. And planes. And nuclear reactors. And spacecraft. In a geological eye blink 12,000 years from stone tools to leaving our gravity well. Under what pressure? James considered. Each other, mostly. Once we'd outcompete the other predators, the primary selection pressure was other humans. which is not a proud thing to say, but it's accurate. Human history is substantially a record of human beings trying to kill other human beings with increasing efficiency. And yet, Vorchuk said, you are here, at a peace summit, working to prevent a war. Yes, between species that are not your own. Yes. The delegate's colors shifted slowly through something James had to hold at the edge of his translation ability. Why? Vorchuk asked, and the color underneath the word said that this was the question, the one the delegate had been building toward through the entire conversation, the one that the corridor and the 40 minutes and the salute had all been preliminary to. James looked at the closed doors of the assembly hall at the far end of the corridor. Because I've seen what happens when communication fails, he said. Every conflict I've been in, everyone, without exception, started because the two sides could not hear what the other was actually saying, or could hear it and chose not to. He looked at his hands, the ones that had responded to a Keth salute in the Keth visual grammar, the ones that had broken 3 people today. I spent years in environments created by that failure, by the space that opens up between what one group of beings means and what another group of beings hears. I thought maybe I could be more useful working on that part, the hearing part. And the other part? Vorchuk asked. The part we saw today? The other part, James said carefully, is what I am when the hearing part has already failed, when it's already too late for words. And which part do you prefer? The words, James said without hesitation. Always the words. Vorchuk was quiet for a moment that felt enormous. In Keth, he said finally, we have a word, not Vorkale, something older. Vorselek. It means the one who speaks before the fighting, and fights so that the speaking can continue. He paused. We have not used that word for a living person in 300 years. The session resumed. High Arbiter Celine opened with her formal statement of regret. Vorchuk responded in the Keth verbal register with measured diplomatic precision, and in the Keth chromatic register with a controlled fire that burned through his entire display, the enormous contained force of a being choosing restraint at great cost. James translated both layers, the verbal for the official record, the chromatic quietly in an encrypted note to Celine's tablet because the High Arbiter needed to understand what Vorchuk was actually saying, the truth under the words, if she wanted to know where the real boundary of his flexibility was. She read it during recess. She came to find him in the side corridor where he was eating something that approximated a sandwich. This chromatic analysis, she said, tapping the tablet. Is this standard practice for your division? No, James said. Why did you do it? Because you can't translate a language if you only translate half of it. She looked at him the way Caliph had looked at him, the way Vorchuk had, the expression that said, I placed you in a category and you do not fit the category and now I have to decide what category you actually belong in. According to this, she said, Vorchuk's actual position on the eastern border claim is considerably more flexible than the Keth opening statement indicates. Yes, and this color sequence, you've translated this as indicating he has personal authority to negotiate beyond the sovereignty's stated mandate, and is prepared to use it if the Varenni position on resource access rights is moderated. That's what it says. If that is accurate dash. If the Varenni modify their position on resource access, James said, Vorchuk has room to move on the eastern border claim, and the Hor Collective's primary leverage point disappears. The summit finishes early. In a good way, Celine said. In a good way. She looked at him for a long, calculating moment. Mr. Okafor, she said, I find myself wondering what this summit would have looked like if you had not been standing by that pillar. Different, James said simply. She nodded, turned to go, then stopped. The chromatic register, she said without turning back. You have been reading it all session. Yes. Since we began. Yes. Then you have been reading dash, she paused. Everything we did not choose to say. Every delegation. All session. James said nothing. Celine turned to look at him. Her expression was something he did not have a clean category for. "Is there anything," she said carefully, "that I should know?" That the words did not say. He looked at her steadily. The horror observer's stillness changed quality at the moment the session was suspended. When the alarms activated before anyone had confirmed a threat, their stillness went from passive monitoring to something closer to anticipatory calm. They knew. Celine held very still. "The delegation," James said, "may not have known the specifics, but someone in that corner knew an attempt was coming. The collective's hardline faction didn't just hire the mercenaries. They had eyes in the room. I would suggest," he added carefully, "that this information be useful before it becomes urgent." Celine looked at him for 3 full seconds. "You were going to tell me this," she said. "Not a question." "I was waiting for the right moment," he said. This seemed like it. The Varenni modified their position on resource access rights on the second day. The Keth chromatic response, which no one in the room officially read but James, told him everything about where Vorchuk was taking the conversation next. He translated the verbal register for the record and sent 4 more encrypted chromatic analyses to Celine's tablet across the afternoon session, each one a layer deeper into what was actually being said in the room, the truth running alongside the official language like a second river. The Horror Collective's observers were quietly asked to withdraw for consultation on the evening of the first day. The request was framed as administrative. The reason was not disclosed to the press delegation. The summit ran 2.5 days. The Verath Accords were signed on the morning of the third day. James translated the signing ceremony in 8 languages. He stood by his pillar. He wore his gray jacket, a new one. The station had found him a replacement. Same furniture shade invisibility. The images that went across the galactic feeds showed Celine and Vorchuk. 2 great figures. The beginning of a piece. James was not in any of the images. He was at the edge of the frame in one of them, barely. A gray shape near the northeastern pillar, slightly out of focus, identifiable only as human by the density of posture, the specific quality of stillness that was not Varenni's stillness or Keth's stillness but something older and more watchful than either. Nobody noticed it. Nobody, looking at the image, thought to ask who the gray shape was, which was, he would have said, just about right. She found him in the corridor outside the ceremony chamber, after the delegations had moved on and the press was occupied with statements and the station had relaxed into the particular exhale of a crisis successfully resolved. She didn't have her official bearing this time. She was just a Varenni woman of senior years with indigo service marks and 40 years of watching everything, and she sat down next to him on a bench that wasn't quite designed for human spinal geometry and said, in standard Galactic rather than Varenni, "Off the record." "Off the record," he confirmed. "Your file," she said. "The unredacted version. The 3 paragraphs behind the black bars." He waited. "I've read a great many files in 40 years," she said. "I've read records of beings who did extraordinary things under extreme circumstances. Files that describe actions that seem impossible until you understand the circumstances, and then they simply seem like the inevitable result of what a particular being was shaped to do." She paused. "Your file is not like those files." "No, your file describes actions that seem impossible," she said, "even after you understand the circumstances." James looked at the closed ceremony chamber door. "Earth is a Class 9 death world," he said. "We came out of it, all of us, every human with biology that galactic classification standards were not built to account for. The bone density alone puts us outside 2 standard deviations from the galactic mean. The adrenaline chemistry, the wound response, the pain threshold." He paused. "We've been told fairly regularly since first contact that we're anomalous, that we shouldn't work the way we work, that the numbers don't make sense. And yet here you are," Caliph said. "And yet here we are." She was quiet for a moment. Then, the chromatic register, the 11 languages, the tactical analysis, the combat capability. She turned to look at him. "Is there a reason these things exist in the same person, Mr. Okafor? Or is it coincidence?" The question that cut to it. The question under all the other questions. James looked at his hands. The ones that could sign a Keth salute and break an arm in the same afternoon. The ones that had been, today, a weapon and a word in the same hour. I grew up in Lagos, he said. In Nigeria. On Earth. My mother was a linguist, academic, comparative structures, published 40 papers, spent her career trying to understand how different minds built different languages to describe the same world. He paused. My father was military. 23 years. He believed genuinely, not as a philosophy, as a lived conviction, that you should be able to protect the things that matter to you. That hoping someone else would be capable was not a plan. And you, Caliph said. I thought they were both right, he said. And I thought he stopped. Started again. I was 18 when I saw the first footage of the Varenni border incident. The Verath Station crisis. 43 beings died because 2 delegations couldn't agree on the content of a treaty clause. Not the clause itself, the content. What it meant. What each side understood it to mean. They were in the same room, and they weren't speaking the same language, and nobody in that room was capable enough in both languages to find the actual distance between their positions. You were 18, Caliph said. I was 18, he confirmed. I enlisted at 19 because I thought before I could be useful in a room, I needed to understand what it cost when the room failed. I needed to know what the failure actually looked like. I couldn't study peace without understanding what its absence was. Caliph was quiet for a long moment. And now, she said finally, after today, after all of it, what do you think? He looked down the corridor. The closed doors. The quiet station. The war that hadn't happened, spreading its non-existence outward through 17 inhabited systems, through millions of lives that would continue without ever knowing what they'd been spared. I think the words work, he said. Most of the time. I think if you learn enough of them, all of them, not just the ones you're supposed to learn, and if you're willing to stand somewhere uncomfortable and pay attention, most of the things that seem like they have to be conflicts turn out to be translations. Errors. One side saying one thing and another side hearing something else, and the difference between a war and a negotiation being whether someone in the room can hear both things at once and find the actual gap. And when the words don't work, then I'm glad I spent 4 years learning the other thing too, he said. Caliph nodded slowly. I'm going to recommend to the conclave, she said, a new designation, Security Integrated Diplomatic Specialist. Someone who carries the linguistic portfolio of a senior translator and the operational clearance to function as a threat response asset when the situation requires it. She paused. It would mean a raise. It would also mean a title, James said. People would start looking at me. Yes. Then I'd rather stay at grade 4. Caliph looked at him. You understand that's absurd. It's also the only reason what happened today worked, he said. Because nobody looked at me. Because I was background. Because the gray uniform worked and the pillar worked and the invisibility worked. The moment you give me a title and a designation, I stop being invisible, and the next time, because there will be a next time at the next summit, in the next contested zone, the next time they'll account for me. You're saying, Caliph said slowly, that you are more valuable as something the threat does not know to plan for. I'm saying I'm a translator, James said. That's what I'm there to do. Everything else is contingency. She looked at him with the expression he had been collecting all week. The one that said I placed you in a category and you do not fit, and this time there was something in it that was close, not quite, but close to something like, I understand now why the category was always wrong. Grade 4, she said finally. Grade 4. You're going to drive the administrative team absolutely mad. I've been told, James said, that I'm a challenging file. 6 weeks after the signing, a transmission arrived through the Keth Sovereignty's diplomatic relay, encrypted to Conclave Standard Protocol, addressed to Specialist Grade 4 James Okafor, Human, Conclave Translation Services. Audio only. Vorchuk's voice. In Keth primary dialect. Formal register. James listened to it twice, alone in his quarters on Theta Station, with the lights low and his coffee cooling on the desk beside him. I addressed my council upon my return. They asked about the summit, the security incident, the signing, whether the Varenni had dealt with us in good faith. They asked whether the peace was real. I told them, the peace is real. They asked how I could be certain. I told them that certainty in peace, as in all things, rests on the quality of the beings who made it possible. And I described to them, as accurately as I could, in words and in colors, a being who had been standing by a pillar. They asked what kind of being stands by a pillar in a room full of the most significant diplomats in the known galaxy and watches every door. I told them, the kind that comes from a world that tried, for 2 million years, to destroy them and failed. The kind that learned not from books, not from philosophy, but from blood and bone and the specific gravity of a world that never made anything easy, that the only things worth protecting are the ones you've decided, consciously and completely, to protect. My council asked whether such beings could be trusted. I told them what I saw. Not in the fighting any professional soldier can fight. I told them what I saw in the corridor afterward. A being who, when I addressed him in his secondary language in his primary language, responded in the chromatic register. Who had spent 2 years learning the truth language of a species that was not his own, not to exploit it, but because he believed we deserved to be heard completely. I told them, trust is not given to beings who prove they can hurt you. Trust is given to beings who prove they understand you. And this being, this translator, standing by his pillar, in his gray uniform, whom no one looked at, understood us more completely than most of our own allies do. Pause in the audio. A long one. The kind that, in Keth culture, indicates a speaker weighing something with their whole self. I have recommended to the sovereignty that the conclave be formally requested to designate a human linguistic specialist as permanent liaison to the Keth delegation. I have named you. I understand if you decline. But I want you to know in the colors you cannot see but that I am showing to this recording because some part of me believes you deserve to know they are being shown. I understand what did not happen because you were in that room. The death that did not occur. The war that did not begin. I understand it fully, the full weight of it, the 17 systems and the millions of lives that continue without knowing what they were spared. We have no word, in Keth, for the gratitude that is too large to be called gratitude. So I will borrow yours again as I borrowed it once before. Thank you, James Okafor. The galaxy is quieter for having you in it. He listened to it twice. He sat with it for a long moment in the low light of his quarters, his coffee cold beside him, the stars unbroken in the small porthole above his desk. Then he filed the formal response through the appropriate conclave channels, acceptance of the liaison designation, pending approval, 3 alternative scheduling options for the initial assignment period. Standard procedure. The language of a man who does paperwork because paperwork is how things get done. Then he opened the briefing materials for his next assignment. A 3-way diplomatic consultation on the methane platform stations of the Outer Belt. 3 species, none of whom shared a primary communication modality. The primary language of the first was subvocal vibration at frequencies below standard audio detection range. The second communicated through a bioluminescent skin display system that had never been formally categorized by Conclave Linguistic Services. The third used a pressure wave language that had been documented but never, according to the briefing notes, successfully translated by a non-native speaker. Nobody had wanted the assignment. The briefing was 220 pages. James made a fresh cup of coffee, real coffee, earth-sourced, the one non-negotiable line item in his conclave contract. The small gravity of home carried forward in the dark and opened page 1. He started reading. Outside the small porthole above his desk, the stars were unbroken and enormous and entirely indifferent to what had happened on Verath Station 6 weeks ago. The death that hadn't occurred. The war that hadn't started. The 14 seconds that had quietly, completely, without fanfare or footage or a single image in which a gray-uniformed man was in focus rewritten the next 100 years. The stars didn't know. But somewhere in the data flows of the Galactic Communications Network, rippling outward through Keth relay stations and Varenni diplomatic feeds and conclave security briefings and the word-of-mouth channels of 48 species who had been in that assembly hall. Something was moving. A question spreading. The same question, asked in 48 different languages, in 48 different registers, with 48 different inflections of wonder and unease and recalibration. The translator. The one in the gray uniform. The one who was standing by the pillar. What was he? And the answer, the one nobody had thought to look for until it was standing in front of them. The one that had been there all along, in plain sight, unremarkable, waiting, was exactly the same in every language. Human. Just human. From the death world. The heavy gravity people. The ones who sweat in the heat and refuse to stop. Who build fire for the cold and refuse to die. Who fight each other for 10,000 years and sign peace treaties in the same breath because they do both, have always done both, the breaking and the mending, the fighting and the hearing, the weapon and the word in the same hands without contradiction. The ones who learn your language. All of it. Even the colors. Because they believe that you deserve to be heard completely, not just in the half that's easy, not just in the words you choose to say, but in the truth underneath, the thing you cannot help but mean. The ones who stand by pillars, and watch the doors, and wait. James took a sip of his coffee. He turned to page 2. He kept reading. In the Keth sovereignty, the Verath Accords are taught to young diplomats as a case study in the unexpected. The lesson, as recorded by Senior Delegate Vorchuk in his published memoir, a work that spent 14 months at the top of the Galactic Conclave's nonfiction recommendation list and was notably never translated into standard Galactic, because Vorchuk wrote it in Keth primary dialect and insisted that anyone who wanted to read it should learn, is not about the peace treaty, or the failed assassination, or the security protocols that held or failed. The lesson, he wrote, is this: never categorize a being by the container you place them in. You may find, at the worst possible moment, that the container was always too small. He wrote this in the verbal register. In the chromatic register, which runs alongside the text in the original Keth edition, a visual accompaniment that no non-Keth reader could access without 2 years of dedicated study, he wrote something else. He wrote, "There is a human translator. He stands by pillars. He wears gray. He watches the doors. If you find yourself in a room where he is present and no one is looking at him, look at him. That is where the safety is. That is where the peace is being held." Excerpt from the Keth language first edition of the Verath Piece. A personal account. By Senior Delegate Vorchuk of the Keth Sovereignty. Standard Year 2387.